Are you curious about new South African wine styles, and regions to try? Should you buy wines based on medals they win in competitions? And what is a Cape Master? So tonight you're going to get those stories and tips and more. If you are watching this video on the replay, please, in the comments, type the word replay. If you like, tell me where you're logging in from, what's the weather like, maybe which wines you've discovered lately, whatever you like. Of course, if you're here with me live, I'd like to hear from you as well. I'm Natalie McLean, and you've just joined the most passionate group of wine lovers who gather every Wednesday at 7 p.m. to talk to the most interesting people in the world of wine, like our guest, whom I will introduce momentarily. So this conversation is a recording based on what I did for the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast, but I will be live in the comments with you. So if you've got questions, or if you've got a favorite tip or a story that you've heard as we chat, please just type it in the comments and I'll be there responding with you. All right. And I am Natalie McLean. I offer online wine and food pairing courses. And I think that's it for me. So let's go and find out more about our guest. So Dr. Winnie Bowman, is a physiotherapist, biomedical scientist, and she also holds a PhD in education, specializing in didactics. She is an international wine and spirits judge, as well as a Cape Master. Winnie writes about wine, teaches, and presents corporate tastings, and appears regularly on radio and television shows. And she joins me now from her home in Camps Bay, South Africa. Welcome, Winnie. It's so great to have you here with us.
Thanks, Natalie. And I'm very pleased you asked about the weather, because it's actually flippin' freezing here in Cape Town at the moment. We're having
Really?
Well, people always think that it doesn't get cold in South Africa, but it does.
It does. What do you define as freezing? What is cold?
Okay, freezing for me is like around about 10.
10 degrees Celsius?
Celsius, yeah.
Yes.
So
Okay.
I'm like layered up here. So
Well, that is chilly, even for Canada, the great white north. So, yeah, you do get chilled.
we do.
That
We do.
also helps your wines, and we'll get into that because it's not
Exactly.
just one big heat basket there.
No,
Okay,
no.
cool. All right, so before we dive into your wine career, Winnie, tell us why you didn't continue to pursue a career in one of several fields in which you're trained. You're qualified as a physiotherapist, biomedical scientist, as I said, and an academic. So why didn't you keep going with those careers?
Well, the physiotherapy part was quite easy. As I said to you, it's quite cold here now, but we don't really have much snow except in the higher lying areas. So only when I was working in London did I have my first skiing trip at about the age of 23 or 24. And, like when one watches TV and you see all these professionals doing all these wonderful tricks and beautiful balance, etc., etc. I fancied myself on the slopes, and I took one hell of a tumble.
Ooh.
I think I saw the world going past me about 50 times when I
Oh,
reached the
no.
bottom. And I can just tell you that I was wearing a one-piece suit, and I had snow in there where you would not expect snow ever. So, so with this, thank goodness, the only very bad injury I had was a dislocated shoulder,
Wow.
which I came back to Cape Town and had it operated on. And because my arm was in a sling for so long, nobody actually realized that I'd also dislocated my thumb. And when I started working again, it became a problem. So by that time, I'd already decided that I wanted to do some more studies, because I am the eternal student. And in London, I worked at the Musicians and Keyboard Clinic, where we treated quite a lot of patients with repetitive strain injury and tendons and hands and whatever. So it was almost a natural progression for me to go into the world of ergonomics, which was then a part of my biomedical science degree. And then I got into biomechanics and loved it and started working in ergonomics, but it wasn't really what I wanted to do. And funnily enough, I had quite a few jobs in the wine industry, like assessing the workspaces, the methods, etc., and giving advice to wine producers.
Just coincidentally.
Coincidentally. And
Your
I was
clients
drinking
happen to be in
wine.
wine. Okay.
I was drinking wine, and my husband and I always used to travel to wine inspired or wine-rich countries, should I say, in areas. And then during the time as well, I was busy doing work for the Physiotherapy Society in accrediting private practices and medical practices. And again, fortuitously, I met somebody who was assisting me in nailing down the South African equivalent of products that were used in Australia, because we used the Australian program. And she said, "Oh my, this is a wonderful piece of work. Why don't you just write it up as a PhD?" And I said, "Okay then." And and much to the dismay of my husband, thinking I'm now going to be sitting in front of a desk for another 5 years, I started the PhD, and my main supervisor took a job in another country, and she said to me, "I'm not sitting around here waiting for you to finish this thing for hours and days and years. Shake a leg and get it over and done with." So I did that, and then I wasn't using any of it because I was pregnant at the time, and because I was a bit of an older mother, I was also I wouldn't say a helicopter mother. I was more of a sort of hovering spaceship over my child.
Bigger aircraft. Okay.
The poor thing never had a chance, because around every corner I could just see somewhere where he could kill himself. So I was like really just babysitting. And then we went to one of our favorite restaurants one day, and the sommelier at the restaurant said, "Hello, Dr. Bowman, CWM." And I said, "Oh, what is CWM?" And he said, "Cape Wine Master." And I said, "Oh no, I'm not a Cape Wine Master." And he said, "Oh, but you should actually be."
Why did he assume that?
Well, because this is one of the places where we always used to take our own special wines and shared it with him.
Okay.
And he was tasting things that he wouldn't otherwise have tasted, and many of those wines actually made it onto the wine list in the end. So when we were sitting down at the table, my husband said, "You are so flippin' bored. Why don't you go and do wine?" And I said, "Well, you know me, it's all or nothing. I mean, I'm going to go like the whole hog." So the cards just fell right, and I needed to do three courses before you can apply to be a Cape Wine Master, and the courses is 5 years. It's quite hectic, because it's like 4 theory exams, 4 tasting exams, a dissertation, and a presentation, which of course is the worst thing, a presentation to other fellow Cape Wine Masters, and of course that is the nerve-wracking one.
I'll bet.
But
and how is it different from the Master of Wine? It sounds as intense 5-year program.
It is very intense, but it's probably more focused on the South African wine industry. Although a lot of it is the tastings particularly are designed around the International Master of Wine kind of tastings. But one of our 4 tastings is brandy, which they don't do. And that's a historical thing. I think that one of the big producers of brandy in the past had sponsored the Cape Wine Academy, which is where all the introductory courses take place, and so they included that as a sort of thank you or nod to the brandy industry. So that is actually quite a big part of the course, because there's an exam paper also on distillation and brandy, and of course distillations of all kinds. Whiskey, rum, vodka, all over the world, that is included in that exam, and then of course the tasting.
And
So
are there as few Cape wine masters as there are a few masters of wine? Like, is it got a difficult pass rate? And
it has a very difficult pass rate. At the moment, I think we're standing at about 105 that have
okay,
passed over 40 years.
wow, yeah, so
And
small.
there have been over 1,500 people applying to do the course. So there is a high fallout rate because it is quite intense, and it's um, and always with something that is over such a long period, people become despondent or they just don't pass. You know, it's a funny thing to say, but I mean, although one can teach yourself to taste wine well, it's not always that easy to do it in exam circumstances.
Sure, it's
Um,
probably nerve-wracking and,
very,
so specific.
very,
I'm
very.
sure that has an
Especially
impact
when
even
you
on your
think,
senses.
especially when you think you've nailed it in your tasting practice, and you arrive at the table and there are four wines in front of you. You think, oh my word! All I can say it's red, and,
Yeah,
and you have
yeah,
to really
sure.
focus
Yeah.
to get into what it really is.
Absolutely. I mean, when we're nervous, we shrivel into our, well, they call it the old brain. Some people still call it the reptile brain, but
Yep,
that is not
yep.
an expansive way of thinking at the executive front of the brain. So I'm sure it's so difficult. My
It is.
goodness.
It is.
And some people say, like I've heard masters of wine talk about it costing well over $10,000, not just in the course fees, but all the wines they tasted. I mean, can you guesstimate how much you spent just trying to get this designation?
Yes, I would say probably round about that figure, although mine was now a little bit a while ago. And of course, uh, international wines, like I imagine everywhere else, is much more expensive here than our local wines. So it's much more difficult. And in those days, of course, there weren't caravans or things to preserve the wines with. So whenever we tasted wines together in our group, we had to finish the bottle. You couldn't actually keep it for like a couple of weeks to try and really nail the wine.
Right.
So that was quite a difficult thing. But having said that, I qualified in 2008, and at that time we didn't have such a very big international footprint of wines in South Africa. Um, so we could basically practice what was here, but of course with exams they imported wines to put in the exam. So it was quite tough, but of course I think it's tougher today because there are so many more wines that taste the same, and I mean, as we know, global warming and stuff like that has changed the styles of many wines around the world. And if you think of people who used to over oak wines that now pull back on the oak, so now it becomes much more close to something from another country. So it's very
Right.
difficult sometimes to place wines in a specific country.
Wow. But at least you got started tasting early. Apparently, you were 4 years old when you started tasting wine. So you had lots of experience. Tell us about that.
I know, I know. Um, so, so my father used to drink brandy mixed with Coke,
Ooh.
and yeah, and my mother only used to drink red wine, and of course we didn't really like the red wine, but because of the sweetness of the brandy, my father always allowed us on a Sunday just to dip our pinkies into his glass, which I actually quite liked. But when my mother decided sugar wasn't good for him, of course he had to drink it with soda water, and that was no longer so appealing.
Right.
But South Africa, with its wonderful climate, we make unbelievable sweet wines. And again, on a Sunday, we each used to get a thimbleful of muscadel, which of course is hell of a sweet. I mean, it goes up to 200 grams of sugar per liter.
Wow.
And we had that on a Sunday for many, many years. And of course, when I went to university, I went to Stellenbosch University, which is the sort of cradle of oh, I shouldn't say that because Constantia people will kill me. But Stellenbosch is one of the most well known. Let me rather put it that way. Stellenbosch is one of the more well known wine areas in South Africa. So as students, we used to go every weekend and try the farms and have something to eat and so on. It was a great introduction, but it was only really when I started traveling to international wine areas that I really got the taste for it. And also, I loved the comparison between like French wines and South African wines or Italian wines, whatever. I have to confess, at that time, I hadn't been to America at that time. And we have a friend with a wonderful cellar in New Haven, and that is where I sat down and had all these beautiful American wines, and of course ice wine from Canada, which
Yes.
is now incidentally quite a big thing here in South Africa.
Is
We're
it really?
importing, yeah, we're importing quite a few, which is interesting because I mean we make very, very good sweet wines ourselves.
What kind of sweet wine do you make? Is it botrytis or is it a
So,
fortified sweet wine?
right, so there's a whole range. So
Okay.
obviously, so fortified wines would be like the muscadels, which is from muscat grapes. Then there's also another one called Jerapigo, which is unfermented grapes and just fortified. So it's a much fresher taste, and of course um, not as sophisticated as muscadel, which can often be oaked and then fortified. And then of course we do natural sweet, which is not botrytis wines, but just late picked wines.
Okay.
Straw wine, where they either pinch the grape or take the wines off and put them on straw mats to dry out before they press.
Oh,
And
like
then
they do in Amarone in Italy?
yep,
Okay.
yeah. And then botrytis wines, which is quite big in South Africa as well. But I mean, I love those sweet wines, and it seems to me like people are drinking them less and less. So whenever I have a dinner party, I always bring out the bottle, and many times people will say, "Oh no, 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 no sweet for me, no sweet for me," until I say, "Just have a taste, just try it," and before you know it, of course, the bottle's empty.
They love
So
it. Yes.
they love
Absolutely.
it.
And do you bring it out at the end of the meal, typically, a sweet wine, or?
Depending on what I'm serving. If I'm serving something like a liver parfait or something like that, I will definitely bring out the sweet wine at the beginning of the meal. And even, especially in our hot summers, I mean, before we come sit down for dinner, we're always sitting outside looking at the mountain, because my house is in a very beautiful area where I can see Lion's Head and Table Mountain and the Camps Bay beach. So there's lots to look at, and especially on Lion's Head, for example, people walk up the mountain in the evenings, right to the top, and it's become much more interesting since people have cell phones, because you can actually see the line of lights going all the way around right to the top, and people take wine up there and picnics up there, and it's fantastic. And especially with full moon, that's when they really go up there. So we sit outside, have a bottle of sweet wine, and again, very often there's a touch of resistance, but that is soon broken by the beautiful sweetness in the glass.
Oh, I know. Every time I have a sweet wine, I think, oh my gosh, why don't I drink more of this?
I
It's
know,
just so luscious, so
I
sensual.
know,
And you
I
think,
know.
oh no, like you don't want dessert, you don't want to, whatever. But it's a little goes a long way too. It's not like you have to have a whole
Well, a
glass
little goes
full.
exactly, and also sometimes I just serve it as a dessert
Right.
because
Yes.
and it's lovely. But we do make very, very good sweet wines here. Um, and of course it's part of I suppose the very first um, I mean, one of my favorite wines is Van de Constance, which I'm sure everybody knows is a iconic wine from South Africa, and it's just so lovely when you have a glass of it. And as you say, one always thinks I should drink more of it, and I try to. I'm
Right.
I'm draining the lake on the side.
Yeah. Well, I'm over here drinking Canada Dry on its sweet wine, so we all do our part, right, Winnie?
Yep, yep.
um, Before we dive into South African wines even more, tell us about perhaps the worst moment in your wine career. Kind of what happened, and I don't know, anything you'd like to touch on.
You know, Natalie, I think, well, I haven't actually had really very bad moments, and I think the reason for that is that I probably joined at a later age when um, people weren't maybe taking me a little bit more serious because I was older,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I think that's maybe why I've never had any problems. But I do know of younger girls, especially entering the wine industry, and it's very hard, I think, to make a name for yourself and be taken seriously
Mm-hmm.
because I remember an incident of a friend of mine who posted a picture of herself in the vineyard, uh, busy helping somebody to prune the grapes, and somebody posted back, "Oh, lovely bunches."
Oh.
And it was so terrible because she phoned me in absolute tears,
Oh.
and it's so sad that we still have to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it took quite a lot of talking to her to say, just look past it because you know who
Right.
you are,
Sure.
and we all have to do that. And maybe I just come a bit, I come across a little bit more strict or something that. No, no.
You're also Dr. Bowman, so that's another credential in your favor. So don't
Exactly.
cross Dr. Bowman.
Don't make me cross. No.
All right, then take us to your best moment of your wine career so far.
Oh my, there've been so many, but the best moment for me was a vertical tasting of 50 years of Sassicaia
Wow.
in Rome, in the palace or apartment of the of one of the popes, the one where they shot the movie Room with a View. Do you remember that
Okay.
movie?
Yes, yes. How did you
Okay, so
manage to get in there?
well, it was it was actually such a coincidence because the Gambero Rosso magazine from Italy, they do these road shows with their winning wines every year, and they'd never actually been to Africa. And then two friends of mine in London, from one from Nigeria and one from Zambia, went to one of their roadshows in London, and they made sure that they met up with the organizer and said, "Why don't we do one in Africa?" And they were actually thinking more Zambia or Nigeria. And then she said, "Oh, lovely, yes, we'll go to Cape Town."
Okay.
So for some other reason, we connected, and I helped them organize the local part of it. And then when they were here, the organizer said to me, we're having this celebration of 30 years or 40 years or something of the Gambero Rosso magazine, and we're doing a very special tasting, and would you like to come? Well, I think I went only with a panty in my handbag and I was gone. So it was fantastic. It
Wow.
was about 14 of us, and the only dampener is that the owner of Sassicaia had actually spoken to them before and said he's got this range of 50 wines which will never be tasted again because one or two of the vintages only had two bottles left,
Whew.
and they said, well, why don't we do it together with our celebrations? And it was arranged like that. And shame, a week or two before the tasting, he fell in the vineyard and knocked his head on a rock
Oh.
and ended up in hospital. And that was actually the first time that his daughter, Priscilla, conducted a tasting. And I mean, what a tasting to start your tasting career off with, by presenting 50
Absolutely.
years of Sassicaia. It was,
Sassicaia, and just for perhaps the few people who might not know, this is one of Italy's most coveted wines. They call them Turbo Tuscans or Cult Tuscans,
yep, super
Super
Tuscan.
Tuscans. Yeah, and it's iconic. It even has its own appellation now, DOC, I'm not even going to pronounce it, but these bottles go for what, 500 or more a bottle when
More.
they're released?
Yeah,
Something crazy.
absolutely.
Yeah. So you're
Well,
tasting
well,
50 vintages, or 50
50
vintages, did you say?
vintages, 50
Wow.
vintages of that. It was something that I will never forget. I still look at the photographs, and I still have to pinch myself to say that I was really there, and it was really fantastic. And also what it showed me, because they were they called Super Tuscans because of course they contain Cabernet Sauvignon, which is not part of the appellation of Tuscany, and so they couldn't call them by the appellation. They just had to be wine of Italy, which is sort of a no in international wine circles.
It's
But
like being relegated as a country wine, a cheap little
correct,
country wine. Didn't have an
correct.
official designation, prestigious.
So,
Yeah.
and they obviously stuck it to the establishment by making these wines the most expensive in Italy, number one. And of course, as you now say, they are cult wines, and they are sought after all over the world, and good for them.
Yeah.
Because I think that's wonderful to just stick to your guns and do something that you think can work in your area, and go for it.
Sure, absolutely. And how did you notice? I mean, the wines, they're beautifully built, so to speak, beautifully made, so they're going to last, they're going to be ageable, they have that natural acidity that many Italian wines have. But what did you notice in the way they aged? Was there anything particular to them or to Italian wines that you noticed as they age? Like what happens versus other wines, other regions?
Well, the interesting thing is about those wines is that from the oldest one, you could taste that they were old, but they were certainly not tired or gone. They were those were wines that were obviously very beautifully stored in their own cellars, and poured very specifically. I mean, they had a master sommelier opening the bottles and checking the bottles and pouring the bottles. It was all like sort of military precision in terms of running the tasting. But the wines were remarkably fresh and beautiful. And of course, we know that Cabernet Sauvignon can age for many decades. And also, I think, because I was in Spain last week, and I tasted some old Rioja wines, which I felt, and it reminded me actually of the Sassicaia tasting, because we tasted a 1956 Marcus de Riscal wine, which was quite a special treat for us last week. And I thought back to that tasting, and I just thought, I felt that those wines were much better preserved and much better perhaps served. And I think, which of course we all know, not all wines are made to age. And which is something I do know, but I don't always follow my own knowledge, because very often I do find a wine that I always think, I'm keeping it for a birthday, I'm keeping it for this, I'm keeping it for that, and then when I open it, it's corked or it's overaged or oxidized, and I'm very, very disappointed that I'd not drunk it at its prime. Yeah. So I think one should pay very close attention to vintage conditions, and read up a little bit more, particularly if you have an older wine. And of course, the main thing for me is where it was stored and how it was stored, because that is paramount in aging any wine.
It sounds like those Sassicaias were like octogenarians that were still doing Pilates, and
exactly.
they may have been old, but they were
exactly
wise. What was the oldest vintage you tasted of the Sassicaias?
I'm trying to think now, but it was the early 50s.
Oh, okay, wow.
Yeah,
cool.
And that's amazing, actually, that we don't think of the Super Tuscans as being around for so long.
No, that's true. We think of it still as a recent,
as a relatively, a relatively young movement, so to speak.
It's true. And so you taste many, many wines in the competitions you judge and so on. How do you avoid palate fatigue?
Well, Natalie, well, some competitions we taste 100 wines a day.
Okay.
And that's quite tough. But
Hmm.
I always try to have like a very neutral breakfast, like just plain granola or something like that, and make sure that I do have a proper breakfast, because it's the worst thing you can do is go with tasting wine with not having had any food before.
Right, because the
Um,
wine will absorb through even your soft tissue, right?
the
Even
wine
if you're
even
not
absorbs through your cheeks,
swallowing.
and
Yes.
um, and and when you're judging in a competition, it is obviously my duty to judge the first wine as well as the last wine, and that
Right.
they all should have the same consideration from me as a judge. And the last wine might be the best wine, but if you've not adhered to the rules, i.e., spit very specifically, and I do spit like twice. And also, the other thing is to drink enough water, because obviously alcohol is dehydrating. So if you never drink water or rinse your mouth with water, all you're getting is that continuous drying of your saliva, and you can't taste properly anymore. So what I do is I rinse my mouth with water, and I drink a lot of water. I drink probably, if I'm tasting 50 wines, I would drink at least a liter of water during the period of the tasting.
Right. Well, that's good advice for anyone who wants to taste more than a few wines.
Yeah.
Um, and of all the competitions that you've judged, which one has been the most interesting for you? Tell us a bit about it.
So I've judged in many competitions. I've actually got two that I thought were quite interesting. The one was uh, and that was only because I never realized this. I judged a competition in America in the Finger Lakes, and I didn't actually realize at the time that every single state in the US makes wine, including Texas. I never knew that.
Hmm.
So that was quite interesting, and also to taste the grapes that were not Vitis vinifera, um, more the Lambrusco that you do get in the States. But from a learning point of view and a technical aspect, the IWC International Wine Challenge, there we taste grapes from all over the world, and we I see grapes there that I've never seen before in my entire life. So it's always a good learning experience when you're tasting those grapes, because it's, one gets used to the things that you produce in your own country, and perhaps in your comfort zone when you're um, traveling internationally, to taste the same things that you're used to. But in a competition, you don't have a choice. You have to taste what's in front of you. And for example, this year, we had, for the first time, I tasted wines that are new grapes, like Sauvignon Gris, which is a grape that was specifically designed. It's one of many specifically designed to be drought resistant, which of course is very important for the future of the wine industry, and disease resistant.
Oh
Again,
wow.
because we need to be farming organically, and we need to be doing as little as possible to any crops in order to sustain the soil, to sustain flippin' humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. And how did they create this grape? Was it just a cross graft or was it genetically modified? How did they create the
I
Sauvignon
think
Gris?
it's a cross graft. I
Okay.
am not entirely sure,
Okay.
but they were very interesting, and I mean, remarkably tasted like grapes. If you know what I mean.
Oh,
They were
a
proper
grapey
wines. They were
taste.
proper wines in their own right, because
Okay.
there are very many. Um, Like, for example, Koshu from Japan has a completely different flavor spectrum to wines that one would taste every day. And of course, because there's such a small wine industry in Japan, we don't always see those wines on the shelf to try them in other conditions than competitions. And of course, most of it's drunk in Japan.
Hmm.
I mean,
Right.
similarly in Switzerland, the Swiss grape varieties like Chasselas and Petit Avin, all of those grapes you hardly see outside of Switzerland. and it's a completely different flavor profile and taste. So that's what's interesting for me about competitions, is that I taste different flavors, and of course it expands my own tasting memory for when I taste South African varieties or South African competitions against the things that I've tasted in international competitions, because it also reminds me of the quality of our wines and whether we are actually on a par with the world,
Sure.
which for me is very important
Absolutely. Yeah.
to recognize.
Yeah. Well, it's like, I don't know, the analogy might not hold up, but it's like you don't wear the same perfume every day, or you accommodate
Exactly.
to it, sort of
Yeah.
cellar palette or whatever. You're trying
Correct.
different flavors, scents, aromas. And has anything ever unusual happened at one of those competitions?
Oh my, yes.
Yes. Like?
So I remembered it at one competition. I was tasting with this chap, and we chatted beforehand, and he said to me, "Oh, you're from South Africa?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, yeah." I said, "Do you know many South Africans?" And he says, "Well, my wife's South African. That's why I recognized your accent." And I said, "Oh, okay." Anyway, and he was sitting next to me, but I wasn't really paying much attention to him. And about half an hour later or an hour later, this guy just like fell boom over off his chair.
Oh, no.
And we looked and thought, oh my gosh, what has happened to him? And with this, he bumped his spittoon over, and we realized there was nothing in the spittoon.
Oh, he had
So
been
this
swallowing
chap
all of it.
had been swallowing all the wine, because they all think it's just like a little sip, a little sip, a little sip. Anyway, a couple of years later, I'm chairing my panel at another competition, and I see this chap, and I say, "I'm sure we've met before." And he said, "No, I've never met you before. I've never seen you in my life before." I said, "Geez, I can't remember now." I said, "Are you not married to a South African?" He goes, "Yes, I'm married to a South African. How did you know?" I said, "No, I definitely know you from somewhere." Anyway, we started tasting, and lo and behold, same
He did the
story.
same.
Half an hour later, boom, he just went to stood, and I said, now I remember where I know you from.
Of course, he doesn't remember anything because he
He
was
doesn't remember anything.
swallowing everything.
Well, and that, of course, is like a complete, absolute no-no in any
No.
competition situation.
So how did he get invited to like a second? I guess the organizers just didn't
Well,
realize what
the
he'd done.
organizers don't talk to each other, because they're all running their own thing, and they're all having their own sort of intellectual property or whatever. So they don't,
Sure.
and often people don't check on other judges,
Right.
So and that's interesting at the IWC, the International Wine Challenge, is that every day we have to write a report. Everybody on the panel has to write a report on everybody else on the panel, so that they have their own database about the ability, the team playing ability, that kind of thing. And that's very important that you have, because, a competition is obviously only as good as its judges.
That's true. It's like the workplace 360 evaluation when you evaluate
Correct.
both those you report to and
Yep.
those who report to you and your colleagues. Yeah.
Correct.
Yep. Oh,
And
that's
it's
a good
not
idea.
just the top down, it's bottom up as well. So
Sure.
the associate has to write about me, for example, and what they thought of the day, whatever. So there's a responsibility on everybody to actually, as I said earlier on, give every wine the proper consideration from one to last.
That would definitely keep the standards high at that competition.
Yeah.
So, what's your opinion of the influence of wine competitions and the medals they award versus wine scores on consumer decisions?
Yeah, it's a very interesting one, that, Natalie, because with social media today, there's so much more coming from, I don't want to call them influencers now, but your friends. Because if a friend says, "Sherbet, I've tasted this wine, it's bloomin' delicious, you must try it," that is such a strong recommendation to somebody that they would probably take that over a gold medal or a whatever. I still think that like best in class carries quite a weight, because for example, if you have, say, 300 entries for Chardonnay, and there's a top Chardonnay, it has to really carry some weight, because
Sure.
a panel would have chosen that wine, and then in the final analysis, when all the top wines are tasted, the consensus would have been that that would have been the best wine. So that's quite an interesting one to look out for then, if you are inclined to go for the recommendations of other people. I mean, for me, there are a couple of reasons I think why people enter competitions. One is to have a peer review of their wine, because that is something I often discuss with producers. If they say, where does my wine sit in, say, for example, in South Africa? And then I say, well, have you tasted your neighbor's wines? And have you tasted your competitors' wines? And have you tasted wines more expensive than yours or cheaper than yours, the same price? And have you tasted international examples of the same wine? Because only then can you really see where your wine fits in, and if you're charging too much or too little, or your label isn't as attractive as some of the others, because that also plays an important role when people think. But for me, as far as competitions go, I think it's a good benchmark. But of course, you can enter your wine for one competition and get a gold medal, and the next competition you get nothing.
Right.
Because wine is a living thing. I mean, not two bottles are exactly the same. I mean, they evolve, depends on, as I said earlier, on how they've been stored, where they've been stored, how they've been handled from where you got the wine from to the competition, etc., etc. I mean, for example, in international competitions, wines can probably sit in a dock waiting to be released by the authorities and the red tape, and who knows if it's sitting in the hot sun.
Right. Yeah.
Before
So
it gets
bottle
to the
conditions
tasting
are the
menu.
same, and no two judges are the same too. So
Well, that's the other thing. Exactly. But I
Sure.
think in the future, I think more people will probably pay attention to reviews from their friends and
Yes.
recommendations from people who they trust, pretty much like a movie critic. I mean, if you find a movie critic who has the same taste as you, you're much more likely to follow his recommendations than somebody who doesn't like the same genre as you, or whatever. So I think
Exactly.
wine in the future will be very much more social media driven, recommendation driven, than competition stickers. And of course, the other
There's so
thing
many.
is,
Yeah.
sorry.
Sorry. There's so many parallels with books here. Like just as you talk, because I've just published my third one, and I'm thinking, yeah, it's when a friend recommends a book to
Correct.
another friend that is far more powerful than a book review or even a television interview. I mean, nothing beats that, especially if you know the friend has a similar taste.
Correct. So
Yes.
I think that's what the future is going to be, of wine, and of course, I mean, I'm speaking a bit against myself here in the sense that I judge so many wines every year, so I might be out of a job soon. But it's just that it's expensive to enter competitions. It's also difficult for people to decide where to enter their wines, because I know, for example, of some producers that say, I always do well at this competition, but poorly at this competition. So
Right.
people have to fiddle around to find out where their wines will do the best, because ultimately, when you enter a competition, you want a sticker for your bottle and
Right.
recognition for your efforts, and that is where people have to work this all out, because competitions are expensive, and particularly international competitions where people have to send their wines in, and pay for the cost of the transport, etc., and the import duties and all of those things that go with it.
Yeah. And are there certain things that, as consumers, we should be wary of when it comes to competitions? I mean, if for the average consumer, they're not going to look into the practices of every competition. How do we know we're not just looking at medals that were awarded where, as long as you pay the fee, you're going home with a gold or something, even a medal of some sort? How do we distinguish that?
That is a very big problem because there are competitions like that. And also, very often, I've also seen that the bronze medal sticker is very similar to the gold medal sticker.
Ah, right.
So it's very easy in a shop when you're taking something off the shelf to actually think that you've picked a gold medal winner, for example, but actually it's a bronze, which it's there and thereabouts. I mean, the wine got a medal, but there's a very big difference between a bronze medal and a gold medal.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've also seen, Natalie, which is a little bit cheeky, is wine labels with like an already medal sticker on it. And if you look closely, it will say things like made in the vineyard or
It looks like they won an award.
nature's own. So if you look at the label, look that it is actually a sticker from and of course I'm saying recognized competition, but nowadays there's so many competitions that you can't always be sure. And of course, not all the competitions have the same medal value. For example, at the IWC decanter and IWSC, those kind of competitions, and I think I'm not sure about the American competitions off the top of my head now, but 95 is the gold medal, whereas in a different competition, say 87 out of 100 can be a gold medal. And there's a very big difference in the quality assessment of 87 to 95.
Oh, yeah.
So it's very difficult for the consumer. I really think it's very difficult because there are also little competitions, fly-by-night competitions that give the biggest stickers. And how do you know? One has to be very careful when you're choosing a bottle of wine. And I think one should do your homework first. But of course, the problem is once you're in the shop and you need a bottle of wine for tonight, you're going to buy a bottle of wine, and then you're either going to go back to what you know. But for me, it's always interesting to try something different and just expand your tasting palette.
Sure. So to the extent those medals give you confidence to try something new, that's a really good thing. And the only other caveat I would imagine that people need to keep in mind is the very top wines, your Chateau Margaux, and maybe not just that tier, but some tiers under, probably don't enter competitions because they sell everything. They don't need medals on their labels or scores for that matter. They're not sending their wines to be reviewed by most critics, if any.
Correct. So those wines you'll never see in a competition. But I, of course, have my own view about that, and that is also that they might not like what they get. So
it's true. They have everything to lose. If they're the gold standard, why would you risk that?
why would you put yourself out there when you've already got the accolades for being like, say, a first growth?
Yeah, exactly.
They don't enter competitions. So and that makes it quite difficult, and especially if you're thinking of the Bordeaux first to fifth growth. I mean, those are all very fancy wines, but you'll never see them in a competition, so you'll never see them with the sticker on. Sure. And it's quite an expensive exercise just to buy them, to try them, and you might get an odd bottle. And of course, the other thing with those wines is if there is just like the slightest problem with them, like for example, a slight corkiness that is very difficult to detect, all the consumer will taste is, "Nah, I don't like this very much. I don't know what the hype is about." But in the meantime, had that bottle been served in a restaurant with a sommelier, the sommelier would have picked up, one would hope, that there was something wrong with the bottle. So it is a tough business to buy wine.
Yes, but we're both here to help, Winnie, so fortunately.
Yes. Come to my house, Natalie, and all of you. Come taste with me.
Exactly. That is an interesting point you raise about cork, because there's a whole spectrum of corkiness, from just diminishing the wine's natural flavors so that you think, as you said, there's not much there, to real full-on musty attic wet cardboard. So just as a side note, because sometimes you won't even realize it's faulted. As you said, you'll just think, there's not much to this wine. I don't know why.
Correct. What's
It's
the
such a
hype?
prestigious wine. Yeah, exactly. So one of your other passions is teaching wine classes. Tell me about the time when you were teaching a group of hotel students.
Yeah, that was quite an interesting experience because it was the first time that it wasn't in like a wine classroom like at the Cape Wine Academy where I teach quite a lot. So the hotel students, as part of their course, has to obviously be the beverage side of the business, and I was asked to do these courses, and they set all my lectures at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was out in the suburbs, and I thought, no man, I don't like teaching that late. I'm like a morning person. I want to be up and do it. So I phoned the head lecturer, and I said, can we please just move this to like 8 o'clock in the morning? I said, because I've got to go fetch my child from school, and it's like quite difficult for me that time of the day. And she said, oh, no, you can't, because it's wine.
Oh.
And I said, no, I know it's wine, but what's the problem? And she says, oh, no, they don't spit.
Oh.
And I said,
The
no.
students.
I said, no, there's no such thing as don't spit. And she said, no, they all say they can't spit. And I said, what do you mean can't spit? No. So I said, okay, I'll come the first time at 4 o'clock. And I said, believe you me, when I leave there, they'll all be spitting. Because wine tasting is not wine drinking. There's a very, very big difference between the two.
Right.
Anyway, I arrived there and like marched in, and we were doing the theory, everything fine. And I said, right now we're going to taste. And I said, get out your spittoons. And they all just said, oh no, we don't need spittoons. And I said, no, you do need spittoons, because I'm teaching you how to taste wine, and you need a spittoon. Nope. So the first one said, well, actually, we're just going to get nauseous and vomit.
Oh.
I said, okay,
Lots of more
then
painful
that's
ways
what you
to
do. I said, then that's what you do. I said, but just remember, the second time you spit, you're going to spit into that vomit spittoon.
Oh. Oh my God.
Anyway, it happened with the first wine. Of course, 2 or 3 of them started vomiting immediately. I mean,
They
like,
were making themselves vomit just after a taste of
because
wine?
they can't spit. They don't know how to spit.
That just
Anyway,
seems bizarre.
bizarre. So
Wow.
I said, okay, go off, go and clean those spittoons, come back. We didn't do number 2. And one tried it. Oh, actually, it does work. You can spit. So from that day onwards, my next lectures were all at 8 o'clock in the morning. Wine notwithstanding.
That'll teach them to spit.
Exactly.
Ruin for the rest of the day if they don't.
I know.
Wow. All right, so let's get on to more into South African wine. So what things about South African wine would surprise us? I mean, we hear from a lot of regions, including South Africa, and quite justifiably, the quality's improved, there's greater diversity of styles, there's more producers, but can you either dig deeper into some of those areas, or is there something else that would surprise us these days about South African wine?
Well, South Africa is such a, I mean, it's made for wine. The Western Cape, where I come from, is obviously where most of the wine is grown. And we have some areas that are now expanding up the coast, and also inland. We have an area called Carlitsdorp, which is very continental, and that's where they grow all the port kind of varieties and
And
make
what do you
port
mean
wines.
by continental in terms of the climate there?
Very hot during the summer,
Okay.
very dry, very little rain,
Okay.
and very cold, and even frost in the winter. So they can only really plant the things that can withstand those temperatures, and it happened to be the varieties from the port area in Portugal.
Right.
So that is what's mostly grown there. But in Stellenbosch, Franschhoek, Paarl, and of course Constantia, where wine started in South Africa, it's I mean, we have the most wonderful summers, and of course we have climate variation, and particularly nowadays. But South Africa has got so many sunshine hours, and I mean, our wines are it's like tasting the sun. I mean, they just, well, I can't get enough of them. And for example, when I travel, I mean, we're very fortunate. We have a little bolt hole in London, and whenever I have a dinner party there, I only serve South African wine. I mean, I put them in my suitcase. I buy them in London and so on. But South Africa has really developed over the last few years, particularly since the end of apartheid, because obviously before that we were in isolation. We weren't able to export our wines. Plus, in those days, the KWV, which is a abbreviation for a Dutch name, used to take all the grapes, buy all the grapes at very cheap prices from the farmers and make their own wines. And they were the only ones that were actually allowed to export wine until way in the late 80s even. Wow. So when that was sort of stopped, farmers could now experiment and put their own stamp on their wines. And a very, very good example of this is an area about 80-90 kilometers outside of Cape Town, where they were always labeled as bulk wine and bulk and cheap wine. So these were beautiful vineyards, but because it was not a fashionable area, all the wines were either sold to bigger producers as bulk wine. In other words, they either blended it into their own wines or put it in boxes or whatever. It was always very cheap wines. Until the next generation came around, and I remember, in fact, I actually know the guy who started this whole thing, because his aunt was a friend of mine, and we always spent lots of time on the farm, and he was like a tiny little baby crawling around there. And then when he studied wine, he went to his father and he said, I can't do this until I retire. He says, I can't, it's so soul destroying, because it's the same formula every year and every week and every month. He says, I can't live like this thinking this is what I'm going to do until I either hand over to one of my own children or die or just lose the will to live with this boring existence.
Right.
And he said, I want to make something different. And his father said, oh, well, this is not the area for that. And he said, just let me be. Anyway, and he made a completely different expression of Chenin Blanc. And they entered it for the Platter Wine Guide, which is our very good publication here in South Africa of all wines South Africa.
Right.
And the wine got the highest accolade of 5 stars.
Wow.
And that was unheard of, because often before, some of those wines did actually get accolades, but under somebody else's label from a more fashionable area.
Wow. And what was the wine's name? Winery's name?
It's called, it's all from the Brede Kloof, and the wine's called Opstal. So Opstal is the Afrikaans word for homestead.
Okay.
And he was like the 5th, 6th generation chap to farm there. And with his changing things in his own area, there were obviously quite a few other younger people who were also following in their father's footsteps and said, hey, we also want to do something different. And now today, it's a fashionable area. People specifically seek out those wines. And it's just a success story that would not have happened if these kids did not decide to actually take the bull by the horns and do something exciting. So,
and what was the region called?
The Brede Kloof.
Okay, that's the region.
Yes.
Okay.
But similarly, Natalie, the Swartland region, which is now so famous, and it was by a few guys who just said, we're going to make these wines in these rugged conditions, and we're going to make beautiful wines that are respected worldwide. And now you've got somebody like an Ibn Sadi, who is well known all over the world. Not everybody can drink his wines because he doesn't make so much, but wherever he goes, people want to taste his wines, and that was a completely unfashionable area. And the other thing is, we started with documenting all the old vines in South Africa, and we've got a lady called Rosa Kruer, who's a viticulturist, and she went around identifying all the old vineyards, because very often those old vineyards, the farmer didn't make wine and just sold the grapes off to somebody, who would just put it in a big blend. And now we've got people specifically seeking those tiny little pockets of very old vines. And in fact, there's a whole new industry in South Africa of, for example, pruning the old vines is much more difficult than pruning a newer vine that was actually set up to be sort of properly planted and trained from the very beginning, because these old vines are mostly bush vines, which are just, they're not trellised or anything. They're just like a bush of grapes, so to speak.
Right.
And so that's a whole new area in South Africa where we're doing specialized training for pruning and stuff. And in fact, Rosa's been approached by people in Spain and Italy to come over there and show them how we treat our old vines, because they are also getting into the thing of older vines. And of course, that's not only a sort of a way of labeling wine, because in South Africa now there's a label for each old vine registered, or a registered wine from an old vineyard, which dates the vineyard age on the bottle. So you can see all of that. But so now there's a whole new thing in sustainability about old vines, because in South Africa, apparently, which I only learned this last week, most vines only last 18 years before they're pulled out. And it takes 5 years or so to actually get grapes from a vine to make wine that we all want to drink. So it means that you've actually really got like 13 years of use of your vine, and we all know it's quite expensive to re-establish a new vineyard, for which you then have to wait another 5 years before you can harvest those grapes. So,
and were they replanting them so quickly, so to speak, because they just wanted the vigor of new vines? I mean, we all know that old vines produce smaller fruit and much more complex, interesting wines, but they don't produce a lot. So I guess they were seeing the trade-off. It was worth just ripping up and replanting?
Ripping them up and planting new ones. So it was very interesting, because I went to a talk by Aubrey Beeselaar, and I don't know if you have Kanonkop wines in Canada. But that's sort of our number one, I would say, winery in South Africa. And he was saying that they had to relook their whole system. And he said, we're already making wine as well as we can. We already have our vineyards in as good a condition as they can. So what else can we do in order to make our wines better? And the things that they came up with were all things to do with sustainability. Introducing the natural fauna and flora into the vineyard. For example, they're now going to put cattle on the farm, because the cattle will be, number one, sort of be an automatic. Mm-hmm.
Oh, is it for the fertilizer, or because they'll be turning
fertilizer,
up the soil, like till?
Plus churning up the soil in between the vineyards, that kind of thing. And planting, they've spent lots of consultation hours with botanists to actually establish what used to grow in the area, so that they could plant those around the vineyards, so that you're re-establishing the stuff that was already there in the very beginning that flourished. So, which makes it much cheaper in a way because the stuff is there already.
Sure.
And it protects the vineyards and is very sustainable because, I mean, whether we like it or not, we need this earth to can continue for generations to come, and we need to do things that will make that happen. And I'm hoping that wine's not the thing that's going to be falling by the wayside. So
Sure.
we're doing all we can here in South Africa.
Absolutely. No, that is great. I mean, lots of interesting changes there. Now, I wanted to touch on Pinotage, which I believe is
Yeah,
a blend of Pinot Noir and Cinsault.
yeah,
If I've got that correct, yes. If I remember my
yes.
notes. It's often considered South Africa's flagship red wine, though you do many different red wines very well. Why does or has Pinotage had such a bad rap? And some people would even say, it smells like rubber, some of them. So why was that? What's changed? And what would surprise
Yeah,
us when it comes to Pinotage?
it's very interesting actually because Pinotage is actually a wonderful grape, but I also I was quite upset when I read all those things about the burnt rubber and so and so and so, and started looking into what actually caused it, because my initial reaction was, oh my God, they don't know how to make the wine properly. But of course, it turned out it wasn't actually that. It was the creosote, which is the preservation substance that was applied to the poles of the vineyard, that with heat and time there were like phenols, in other words, little pieces of flying matter attaching itself to the grapes and the skins, and that was where the tar came from, because the creosote, which is actually, and the reason they put the creosote at the bottom of the poles is to preserve the wood,
Okay.
but it actually became in fact, it wasn't actually only Pinotage. It just happened to be that that's where people picked it up. It's also been picked up in other parts of the world with things like plums and olives and so on. And it's now nobody uses it anymore. As you'll see, most vineyards have now actually probably got metal poles and stuff like that. But anyway, these phenols attach themselves to the skin of the grape, and it was not actually the grape, the winemaking process. And of course, it also attracted things like smoke if there was a wildfire in the area, and stuff like that, because this creosote is a distilled product from tar in the first place. But I think Pinotage is quite a difficult, as a friend of mine would say, another kind of an animal. It's a very it's not strange as in that it doesn't taste like any other grapes. The grapes are actually beautiful. I think what has happened over the years is that the Pinotage Association has spent many millions of rands and man hours to actually really nail down what you shouldn't be doing, like with many other grape varieties, where it should be planted, how it should be handled, because people always thought it was quite a robust grape, and it actually isn't, because I mean half of its parent is Pinot Noir,
Pinot Noir
and
is finicky grape.
Cinsault, Hermitage is also not, it's also a lighter style of grape, but so today we actually have very good Pinotages, and it's funny because I did a Pinotage tasting. We have a Pinotage top 10 competition in South Africa, and I've got a friend who's got a South African restaurant in London, and I said to her, come on, let's do a tasting there of Pinotage. And she said, oi, I don't know about my clients and and I said, look, you get them here. And she's quite forceful, my friend, and she phoned them up and said, if you ever want a table here again, you will book for the Pinotage taste. Anyway, and she did get I think there were about 30 or 35 people. And it was an eye-opener, because people came with preconceived ideas of what they were going to be tasting, and they were all saying, "Oh my word, I don't want to taste burnt rubber. I don't want to taste burnt rubber," because the perception was that burnt rubber was a characteristic of Pinotage, which of course it
Right.
isn't.
Right.
And they were very surprised by the voluptuousness and the complexity of good Pinotage. And I know there's Pinotage grown in Canada. Did you know
Right.
that?
Yeah. I've heard, yes, little
Yeah,
bits of it.
yeah.
Yeah.
And in places like New Zealand, which is also a cooler kind of a climate. And of course, with Pinot Noir being part of the parentage, I mean, we get different styles of Pinotage. Like you can get the more floral, sort of lighter style of Pinotage, and then also more to the heavier style, depending, of course, also on the oaking of it. I mean,
Sure.
a lot of people. There was a chap here that started using oak that was quite toasted, and it tasted almost like coffee, which
Oh, yes. There were some
don't
coffee
like.
ones, yes.
Yeah,
There was
I don't
even
like.
one called Cafe. Like it
Oh
was
no,
marketed like
the
coffee.
ones. I know there are a couple that are called something in the line of coffee,
Yes.
and I'm not so nuts about those because to me you're not celebrating the grape, you're
True.
celebrating the method of making, and I don't like that. I actually like the purity of the grape to be in my glass and in my mouth because that's what I enjoy. I don't
Sure.
enjoy very manipulated wines with either too much oak or too much skin contact. I mean, you know, I like, for example, orange wines, but I don't like those ones that taste like fermenting apple juice or,
Mm-hmm.
or oxidizing apple juice. I don't like that. Um,
Sure.
I like to taste. If it's Chenin, I want to taste Chenin. If it's Pinotage, I want to taste Pinotage.
Yeah.
Um, and that's, of course, I mean, that's me, but I just think that that's the way one can enjoy wines and very many different wines because then you don't have to taste the same thing all the time. If you want to taste oak, that's okay with me, but you're not tasting the grapes really then.
Absolutely.
You're only drinking the oak, so to speak.
Well, and speaking of tasting, I don't want to run out of time before we taste two of the wines that you have today. I want to hear about them and I want to hear how you taste them because you do this professionally so frequently. So, what are the two wines that you have with you today, Winnie?
Well, it was very difficult, Natalie, because I like
Okay.
all wine. But today I chose a Chardonnay. I don't know if you can
Okay.
read that. It's
And
a
we'll put the
creation.
link in the show notes as well.
Yeah.
So, which one is it? If you
So this
can,
is creation.
creation. Okay.
It is from the Yemelen area, which is an area which had wine for quite a long time, but there was only one winery called Hamilton Russell. I don't know if you're
Oh, I
familiar with
visited
it.
that one. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
beautiful winery.
Yeah.
Anthony and his
Anthony
wife.
Hamilton
Yeah.
Russell. Yes.
Yes.
And for a very long time, he was the only one in the valley. And
Huh.
then when people started planting, and now, of course, it's like such a vibrant valley with extremely high quality wines. So this is creation, which is right at the top of it's called Hemelenade Ridge. And this is from and incidentally, I told you I was in Spain last week, and I was there for the announcement of the world's best vineyards, and creation actually came fourth in the world, which
Wow.
is quite a feat. So
Hmm.
this is called Glen Chardonnay, and Glen is the son, and he's the fourth generation winemaker at Creation. Well, he's not really at Creation yet. He finished his wine studies last year, and his father said, "You better go and find yourself some jobs all over the world because you ain't coming back here until you can really
Get the
make wine."
experience.
Exactly.
Yes.
So this is his Chardonnay, and they have there a single vineyard which they call the Art of Chardonnay, which is their top wine, and this is a selection of barrels from from that top wine. So they make very few, like, I don't know, 1,000 bottles maybe of this, but it's absolutely fabulous. And you'll see, I've even in the
Lovely golden
Chardonnay glass, but you can see beautiful, beautiful golden color. You might not be able to see it on the screen so well, but there's still a lovely tinge. This is a Glen Chardonnay 2022, so very young. And the Hemel en Aarde is a very cool climate, so one doesn't expect those overt flavors jumping out of the glass. But I've had it open now for quite a while. In fact, I haven't been able to wait for you to ask me to drink it, Natalie, because
That's okay.
it's been sitting here in my nose.
Absolutely.
But this has got I mean, such beautiful honeysuckle and like a lightly roasted almonds and baked apple, lemon meringue, all of those wonderful flavors, and they just keep on coming towards me from here next to me.
And what might you pair that with, Winnie, that wine?
For me, roast chicken, grilled mushrooms, touch of the wine in the pot, touch of cream. I'll be in heaven.
Sounds
So
lovely.
this is really good, and it's this is a 22, but I think the first time the boy made it was about 3-4 years ago, so they don't have a long track record of it. The art is like the parent wine of this one, and that's like about, they've got the farm incidentally is actually celebrating its 21st birthday this year, so it was all wonderful. We were there yesterday celebrating the 21st, and of course the 4th in the world for the best vineyards, and they are an amazing family, because they not only in their restaurant use everything that's like just around them, their neighbors that grow vegetables or animals or whatever, water, anything, olive oil. They've got their own beehives, and they've been instrumental in setting up this Pebbles project, which is schooling for children of all the workers on the farms, meals in the afternoon, transport, sport, etc., etc. But this is really delicious because it's got a wonderful depth of flavor, and I mean, I can still taste it in my mouth now, having spoken for so all the time.
Long finish.
It's got a lovely long finish, and it's just a beautiful wine that you can drink on its own or with food, and that's what I like, because I really like to be able to, especially when I'm cooking, I like to taste some of the wine that's going into the food, and what I'm going to drink, and what I'm going to drink with the meal. So I really, really enjoy this.
Wow.
And then, Natalie,
Yes, what's next?
especially for you, Natalie,
All right.
this is a Beyers Kloof Diesel, and it's a Pinotage. I could not bring a Pinotage.
Of course.
So
Wonderful.
this is a guy. His name is Beyers Tritter. He is, you know, they call Professor Pierold, who developed Pinotage, the father of Pinotage, but Beyers is the king of Pinotage. He loves Pinotage, and in fact, he actually put Pinotage probably on the map for South Africa internationally when in 1991 he won the best red wine at the International Wine and Spirit competition.
Wow.
And it was the Robert Mondavi trophy that he won. And in his speech he actually said, if Pinotage was a woman, she'd be married to me today. So
That's confidence for you.
I know. He loves Pinotage, and he's a big proponent of the Pinotage Association, and promoting quality Pinotage. And we are certainly doing that more and more in this country. More and more people are actually seeking it out and drinking it, because it wasn't only internationally that Pinotage had a bad rap. It also had a bad rap in South Africa because people would say, why would I drink Pinotage if I can have a beautiful Cab or a beautiful Syrah or Pinot Noir from a cooler area like the Himmel and Aarde? And it's a beautiful wine.
Dark.
And the big thing about Pinotage for me is that it's friendly. It's food friendly, and it's just friendly to sit there and drink with your friends, and it should put a smile on your face when you're tasting a good Pinotage. And
I imagine it's not tannic when you say it's friendly. It's easy, smooth drinking?
Yeah, because they have actually learned over the years how to manage the oak treatment of Pinotage in the cellar.
Right.
It's not only South Africa, I suppose, that used a lot of oak. I mean, we also remember like the big Australian Chardonnays, as well as the American wines that were just so sweet and heavy, and all oak. Oak to me
Yes.
should be a sprinkling of spice and not be the wine. I like, as I said earlier on, I like to taste the grape, and that's
Yeah, absolutely. And so what does that one taste?
So
I'll let you
this
sip. What do you get
plums,
from that?
plums and bramble and some lovely dried herbs, and it's almost got like a liqueur like quality on the nose, but again also very full and complex.
And once you
So this is
taste
a
that one, is it full-bodied or is it medium?
it's a full-bodied wine.
Okay.
It goes into all new oak.
Okay.
However, if you've got good, healthy, ripe grapes, it can take the 100% oak because it's got tannins, it's got like a little nip at the end, but it's not bothering you on the palate in terms of overpowering the flavors of the grapes. And that's what I like about this wine. I mean, it is their flagship wine,
Yes.
and they are making they make a hell of a lot of it. But it is something to seek out if you ever get the opportunity. And of
Absolutely. And
course,
what would you pair with it? Yeah.
if you could meet Bayers, that's
Oh,
that's
he's
a bonus.
yes. He and his wife Pinotage.
He and his wife, Mrs. Pinotage, yeah.
Mrs. Pinotage, yes. And what would you pair with that wine, Winnie?
This, to me, a beautiful roast leg of lamb, some olives, because it's also got like a salty, like saline finish. So with olives and even tomato, it's a very versatile wine. And although it's quite a big wine, it doesn't feel heavy, and that's why it'll go with all of those tomato and olive and lovely rare roast lamb leg or whatever. Nice.
Wow.
I'm getting
Well, you've
hungry,
made me
Natalie.
hungry and thirsty. You've done your job. My goodness. And I cannot believe how fast the time has flown here. My goodness. I did promise you a 3-hour interview, but I'm not going to hold you to that. But we've had a wonderful chat, Winnie. Just before I ask you where folks can find you online, is there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to mention before we wrap up?
Well, I just want everybody to come to Cape Town.
Okay.
Come and visit us. Come visit our
Yes.
winelands. Come and visit our people. Come see all the diversity in Cape Town. You know that, Table Mountain alone has got like more biodiversity than the whole of Europe. So we've got plants, we've got people, we've got cultures, we've got everything here. We've got the beach, we've got wine. You've got to come. And now that I know you've been here before, you're going to have to come again, Natalie.
Absolutely. Yes. We'll have to have a glass of wine in person next time.
That'll be lovely.
And where can we find you online, Winnie?
So on Twitter, I am at WinBeebee, WinBeebee. And the reason for that, of course, is that they've stuffed it up the first time. I was actually only WinB, and okay.
Right.
On my email is winbee, WinBeE at Syrold, which is syrold.co.za. I'm on Instagram as Winnie Bowman, Facebook Winnie Bowman, LinkedIn, I think Winnie Bowman.
Okay.
I think so.
Well, we'll put all those links in the show notes too, in case
Great.
Folks want to
But
reach
anybody's more than welcome to send me some questions or even remarks about South African wines that I can go and talk to those winemakers.
Sure.
Get them on track.
Excellent.
They listen to me, Natalie. They listen.
Yeah, that's right. Don't cross Dr. Bowman.
No.
South Africa is lucky to have you, Winnie. You're such a passionate advocate for the wines in the country, and a real icon. So thank you so much for spending all this time with us. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. So
thanks, Natalie.
Yes, I'll say cheers for now, but I look forward to our next chat and wine.
Thanks, Natalie, and see you all in Cape Town.
All right. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.